Well, welcome back, everyone, to the OGM Livestream Energy Series, where we dive into the latest trends and innovations shaping the energy industry. I'm your host, Tina Olivero, and today we have a very special guest joining us, ESG Strategy and Advisor with over 20 years of experience in climate change, sustainability, and international government relations. Please welcome Meghan Harris-Ngae. Thank you for joining us, Meghan.
Thank you, Tina, for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk about this topic because a lot of people have a lot of knowledge in the ESG field, and a lot of people who are not in that field have no idea what it's about. So do you think you could start us off by sort of defining what ESG strategy and advisory is all about?
Sure. So maybe I'll start, Tina, just by defining what we mean by E, S, and G, because I know that I've heard different ways of representing those letters. So it stands for environment, social, and governance. Other terms that get floated around are sustainability, corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility. And I would say the basic way of defining it is it's essentially looking at, I guess it would be categorized, or it has traditionally been categorized as non-financial issues that matter to business. That has evolved over time, but if you look across the E, the S, and the G, there's a myriad of issues, which I'm sure we'll get into today, that sort of sit under the E, which is environmental responsibility, social responsibility, and then your traditional view of governance. Although when you think about corporate governance, issues around that topic have evolved as well, just given the landscape that we're dealing with.
Right. Okay. And so tell us then about your role at PwC Canada and I guess as a strategy and advisory leader within the organization. What do you do in the run of a day?
So essentially what I do is I work with C-suite corporate executives to really address sustainability. I'm going to use sustainability and ESG interchangeably in our conversations today.
Okay.
Really to look at those issues from a strategic lens. So what I do is work with organizations across multiple sectors to really integrate sustainability or ESG factors into their corporate strategy and look at how they can unlock value for, whether it's financial value or other types of value for their stakeholders. And so that's a big shift. And I know we'll probably get into that today, but traditionally sustainability or ESG has been looked at as something you do for reputation purposes, but you don't necessarily get business value out of it. So where I spend most of my time, or the majority of my time, is really helping, clients unlock value through their sustainability efforts.
So the business of ESG is good business, essentially.
Exactly.
And you sort of prove that in your processes.
Exactly. And I would say, this space has evolved, as I said. So I've been in, the sustainability space for over 20 years. And, for a long time, you saw, percolating regulations around aspects more on the environmental side. You would see organizations issue a number of reports, which we'll get into that, sustainability reports, but that was largely for reputational purposes, not necessarily recognizing that by addressing these issues strategically and integrating them into your business, that you would actually be able to see some sort of value creation out of that. And what I mean by value creation is both, really looking at the business benefit outside of really driving a reputational gain.
Right. Gotcha. So what type of clients would you work with then? And are they all over the world, or who are they? What are they up to?
I do. I work with clients. So I started out working in the energy sector. So I started out in oil and gas. So I work a lot with utilities and clients across the energy value chain. I also work a lot with financial services. So pensions, private equity. I would say throughout my career, I've essentially worked with every industry. And on a global scale, in my role with PwC, I also work with private businesses. So I lead the sustainability initiatives for entrepreneurial private business globally. And so increasingly what we're starting to see is private companies. I mean, traditionally, sustainability was very much something that was led by publicly traded organizations.
Yeah.
But now what we're starting to see is that, family-owned businesses, startups are really starting to see what the opportunity is from a business perspective. And they're actually seeing how they can gain competitive advantage through sustainability. So I work a lot with private businesses as well.
So how big would these companies be? Is it from startup to large publicly traded companies and everything in between?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, when you look at it, you start to see the importance of that value chain, because some of the private businesses and smaller startups essentially are customers of the largely publicly traded, and vice versa. Right. So you're starting to see, how sustainability essentially becomes important across that entire value chain.
For sure. And I guess smaller companies that are suppliers or sub-suppliers of these larger entities, having an ESG plan and strategy in place would be beneficial and give them a competitive advantage in winning bids and being aligned with those larger corporations and their values.
Yeah, increasingly so. And I would say, I've worked with a lot of businesses that are customers of large public entities, and, they maybe traditionally wouldn't have necessarily factored sustainability into their strategy or the way that they see, driving business. But increasingly, those large publicly traded companies are looking across their supply chain and saying, hey, we need to actually see how you're driving some momentum or performance around aspects of sustainability. And the one that I would say gets, the most attention right now is climate change. So looking at, greenhouse gas emissions and carbon, across the supply chain. But increasingly, we're starting to see other issues sort of percolate to be just as critical as climate change.
Right. So I'm a small business and I'm looking to be the most environmentally friendly that I possibly can. What are you telling me to do?
If you're a small business, what I would tell you to do, even if you're trying to be as environmentally friendly as you possibly can, I would say to really make sure that if you're going to make investments in those areas, that you're really balancing that with the business benefit. If I'm really honest, because I have seen, a lot of organizations spend a lot of money and resources trying to be a leader in aspects of ESG, but not necessarily balancing or taking a measured approach to really look at the business benefit of doing so. And the reason I say that is that the bar is continually shifting. So you can continually to invest. But I think that to be a leader just in aspects of ESG, really that has shifted. I'd say the balanced approach to really looking at, balancing your bottom line is really critical. And it's not to say that you wouldn't continue to invest and be a leader in this space. It's just, you want to invest in areas that are going to make sense for your business.
Can you give us some examples of things that would advance your bottom line and be sustainably aligned at the same time?
I would say that if you look across the E, the S, and the G, if we break it down a little bit, I would say depending on, again, where you sit within the value chain, if you're a small business, there's ways to actually think about sustainability issues in terms of maybe your product design or the service that you offer. I've seen a lot of organizations, especially on the data and tech side, really look at, how they can scale their business around sustainability, just given the way that the market is shifting. And so it's really looking at it from that lens and really applying that, if you're looking to gain competitive advantage in your industry, how can aspects of the environment and social responsibility actually help you achieve that? And I've seen a lot of organizations take advantage of that in terms of their product design, especially bringing new products and services to market is really the one that I've seen, accelerate over the last couple of years.
Right. Gotcha. I know, like in my own business, as a publisher of a magazine, I got to the point where I said, I just don't want to chop down more trees to print more paper. And I said, what would it take for my company to become completely paperless? And it was a big challenge. And there was a lot of resistance against it because everybody loved our magazine. It was very, like, for an industry magazine, it was really well designed. You would find it everywhere on tabletops and in offices and bathrooms. And it was just like it was an industry standard. And then I was like, I pulled the plug and said, okay, well, I'm not printing print anymore. And a lot of people were like, oh no, I'm not too happy about that. But then the challenge was on me to find a completely different way of how we would publish that. And so we found something that gives a digital experience, but taking that leap forced me to say, what can I do that's even better? And now we have like a fully integrated interactive magazine. Even this podcast can be accessed through that publication. So I think, like for me, I really learned that even though there was some resistance in the market to try and keep it the old way that it was, by expanding and making interactive publications, you're kind of opening up a whole new world, not to mention the reach and the scope of where we can go with it now, which is global, which wasn't available before.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting about that, Tina, is that's a perfect example of what we're actually starting to see with the impact of some of these issues actually driving reinvention and innovation. So reinvention of business models and innovation. And that's not new, but I would say even when you look at, you know, the disruption caused by, say, climate change, which, you know, we can get into a little bit today, we're starting to see climate change, you know, both from a physical impact of climate change as well as what we would call transition risk, which is the policy landscape, really shifting business models for companies globally. And we've seen lots of different examples of that across different industries.
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating time because we're globalizing and we're also bringing in a sustainable new energy economy all at the same time. And so for me, it was like, how do thank goodness for COVID, actually, because COVID made me stop and reinvent my company for 2 years and say, okay, if you're going to globalize and you're going to focus on sustainable new innovation, architect something that's going to stand the test of time for the next 30 years and to be able to facilitate the process of energy and really guide this new incoming innovation. And that was fascinating to me. It was like a whole new model. And it was almost like I started a new business because it was such a big challenge to architect. But then we started getting like 300 press releases a day of people doing the exact same thing. On a daily basis from around the world. There is a tidal wave of new innovation emerging, and people who decide to get on that wave have this vast future of a global marketplace.
I would agree, Tina. And the other thing that I would say, you know, I often get asked, you know, when it comes to sustainability, why do it, right? So yes, we get there's gains, you know, because our stakeholders care. But when I really look on, you know, to simplify it, it's really around resilience, right? So thinking about the future of any organization, any industry, you know, you'd be thinking about business resilience anyway. But what I'm starting to see, or what really we see, is when you look across the E, the S, and the G, a lot of the issues that sit below those letters, I would say, are critical to business resilience over time, right? And you're starting to see that, whether it's from being competitive, the regulatory and policy landscape, you're looking at all the different macroeconomic factors that are happening around us. And when you actually really peel back the layers of that, a lot of the business resilience that needs to be put in place is anchored in aspects of ESG.
Yeah, that's a really important point there. Yeah, resilience and creativity as well. It's like, how can we be creative enough to build, not just get into a market, but build a brand new market?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. Cool. So let's look at climate change then. Tell us let's dive into that. How is that changing the landscape of the business world? What are people, how are people positioning themselves? How are they availing of a business case for this when it comes to climate change?
So just to break it down, I mean, climate change is a big macro issue that we're dealing with globally, right? So when you think of the physical impact of climate change, and I know it's a polarized topic, in some circles, right? So, but if we just take the political landscape out of it and just look at the impact of the climate changing, that's having a knock-on effect. We're seeing a lot of regulatory change. So globally, you're seeing governments and regulators take action on looking at what are the risks associated with the climate change and climate changing, and then what do we need to do to mitigate that risk, and what does the policy and regulatory landscape need to look like. So that's having a direct impact on organizations, both public and private, up and downstream across the value chain. If I break it down a little bit and really explain what I mean by climate risk. So obviously you're seeing, different, and I'm not a climate scientist, so bear with me, but you're seeing the impact of the climate change and changing weather patterns. And there's many different examples of that. Yeah. And when you actually break it down, that's having a significant cost implication on organizations as they look at, building the right resilient infrastructure, looking at their operations and what they need to do to actually mitigate the risk of the climate changing on their business, right? And that's going to mean different things to different industries. Yeah. When you look at the other side of climate change, I would categorize it as transition risk. And what I mean by transition risk is when you look at the global energy transition that's happening, that's obviously impacting organizations up and downstream. And there's a lot of opportunity anchored to that. But transition risk could be categorized as, carbon pricing. We see carbon mechanisms globally in different jurisdictions. You're seeing a lot of policy change, as I said. And then just generally, the whole decarbonization landscape, we've seen, I'd say over the last 5 years, most organizations are, especially on the public side, are looking at what do they need to do to decarbonize their operations to, mitigate some of the transition risk, I would say, associated with their business. And so they'll set targets. So we've seen 2030, and obviously, COP has and we can get into COP a little bit, but a lot of that's come out of COP with a focus on 2030 as a year for big reduction. And then net zero by 2050 is probably one you've heard a lot about. And if you actually go back to my earlier comment, a lot of that, if you think about business resilience, there's an importance in, looking at these targets, 2030 and beyond to really future-proof businesses to really deal with the risks associated with climate change.
It seems like a lot of the larger companies are coming to the table to hit that 2030 target. I'm seeing that Fortune 500 companies really are well on their way to being able to do so. That's encouraging, especially, I'm from Newfoundland. Our wind energy, hydrogen boom is about to take off here. We've had top Fortune 500 companies from all over the world come to see about the potential for, setting up shop, investing here and developing hydrogen to meet world energy demand, the energy crisis happening in Europe, and being able to build on the hydrogen plays that are possible from Newfoundland. Newfoundland's one of the windiest places on earth. So we have land, we have water, and we have wind, and we're in very close proximity to Europe. So to me, it's really, I guess, such a positive thing to see these global companies. I mean, we've never had a product that hasn't even been produced yet, and people are just lining up to buy it. We've never ever been in that. We've never been in that position. And, in my 33 years of business, I have never seen anything like that. So I feel super optimistic about the future.
Yeah, that's great.
There's some people that are kind of like, well, we don't want wind, we don't want wind turbines. But, when it's all said and done, there is an global energy demand to meet. And without that, the whole house of cards falls. And when the house of cards falls without energy, then we're really in trouble. Then we're talking about, lack of food supply. Then we're talking about ecosystems and social services just deteriorating. We somehow have to be able to build both. And that's kind of the challenge and the resilience, as you said, that we're in now, to be able to get to net zero with a new sustainable energy model and meet the energy demands that are driven by population increases at exponential rates. So it's a lot of moving parts, very interesting time, but people who can see the big picture can really see the opportunities.
Yeah, I would say the way I would describe that, Tina, is just the changing energy system on a global scale. And there's a big focus, as you know, and again, anchoring back to climate change a little bit, on reliability, right? So making sure that we're actually building the infrastructure to really deal with the energy system of the future. And that's what we're seeing, a lot of collaboration on across all aspects, whether it's governments, public organizations, municipalities, right? Because again, as we think about the need for reliable energy sources globally, that's going to become increasingly important. Not that it wasn't important before, but it becomes complicated, right? Given some of the macro issues that we're dealing with. And then the other side of that is when you think about, the changing energy mix and the changing energy system, we're also dealing with a number of perhaps conflicting or maybe aligned issues on the social side. So there's a lot of focus on, making sure that we're balancing our economy and also dealing with affordability, right? And so there's a lot of complex issues that are tied into that changing nature of the energy system at the moment.
Yeah. And then to add another even more exciting variable into the equation, we have AI and automation coupled with sustainability.
Yeah.
And then these things are changing the dynamics entirely. Like I was just reading an article about a lot of the work manufacturing that's done in China by the US and Canada now coming back to our home turf. Because of AI, because of automation, those systems are now affordable for us to be manufacturing in North America. And that's changing the whole dynamic initiative as well. Like Honda just came back to Canada with a whole, new manufacturing initiative. And that's driven by AI and automation. So it's a whole brand new world out there. And in one way, it's globalizing, and another way, it's localizing all at the same time. There's all these variables. Yeah, it's so interesting, I must say.
Yeah, I would say AI is the next. And when we look at all those macro factors that are sort of swirling around us, I would say AI is one that is essentially having an impact. And when you actually look at, again, going back to some of these issues that I'm talking about under the ESG umbrella, AI is going to play a pretty critical role, in terms of improving a lot of aspects of sustainability. Let's just say that. And we could get into that. I'm not an AI expert, but what I can tell you is that a lot of the questions that I do get asked is how does AI play a role here, right? And what's the opportunity to adopt AI to improve, our environmental, social, and governance performance?
Are there any sort of glaring, places that stand out to you that you could share with us?
I'd say the one that will probably take off the fastest, or that, we often discuss, is how do you apply AI in an operational context to decarbonize operations, right? So how can you actually look at, if you've got a path around decarbonization out to 2030 or beyond, it's probably going to be more the beyond. How can you actually apply AI within the context of your business to really help shape that decarbonization path? Right.
Yeah.
And I've seen that a lot in the agriculture side of things globally, but increasingly you're starting to see it in other industries as well. AI is still, it's changing every day, right? So the applications and the use cases are going to change dramatically over the course of the next couple of years.
Yeah. Well, I hope it gets to the point where it just takes over everything we don't want to do.
Yeah.
Everything that doesn't require your resilience and your creativity, send it over there to the AI department. That's my long-term vision for it. Anyway, so interesting. So then there's also the piece about collaboration. It seems to be crucial in advancing sustainability efforts. So from your perspective, what role does collaboration play in driving those sustainable practices?
It's pretty critical, Tina. So when you actually look at across the E, the S, and the G. Increasingly, I mean, this space, again, is not new. And traditionally, you would see partnerships between government, NGOs, business, right? The concept of public-private partnerships, that's not new. But I would say there's always, a natural tension, right? Because everybody's got their own objectives, right? Depending on which side of the issue you're on. And so, collaboration is going to become increasingly important. And we've seen different elements of collaboration within the same industry. So companies coming together depending on where they sit in the value chain and collaborating. I know, one that I'm very familiar with, I'm based in Calgary. And so one that I'm very familiar with is the Pathways Alliance, right? Which is quite unique.
Right.
And that's a good example within the Canadian energy context. But there's many different examples of where organizations are coming together to really, look at how they can collectively deploy capital to solve a big societal problem, right? And I think increasingly we're going to see more of that.
Yeah. I mean, in one sense, the United Nations has always tried to do that. Global collaboration efforts when it comes to our social infrastructures. My father used to work for the UN.
Okay.
And yeah, so I was very familiar with his work and, all of the United Nations themselves coming together with their own initiatives to improve society as a whole. And when I look into things like Pathway Alliance, organizations that do see the big global picture and are being able to bring together all of the organizations with similar visions and goals, that to me is, what's the word for it? Like the free enterprise infrastructure, if you will, of being able to bring together the greatest minds and to be able to solve these issues with precision. And I don't know, nothing seems more exciting to me than that. Because
I think the opportunity to collectively innovate around a problem, right? And to actually, bring, to your point, different minds, different technologies, and frankly, capital to solve a collective problem that a group of entities are all trying to tackle. And really, if we're going to move the needle on any of these issues, there has to be collaboration across different entities in order to solve for it.
Mm-hmm. And I know this might be a bit of a stretch, but my own philosophy personally is that, if we have big problems like climate change, it's those types of challenges that brings the world together. It's those types of challenges that stop wars. It's those types of challenges that make us say, hey, we've got to get out of our own space here and start to integrate and collaborate. And hopefully, with a challenge as big as climate change, like maybe Mother Earth will teach us all a lesson and get us all on the same page here.
Well, I think that's already happening. I can tell you it's becoming more and more disruptive every day. And so, if you think about it, I would say even anybody, folks that don't necessarily sit within the sustainability side of an organization are starting to actually see the daily impact of some of these issues, including climate change. And so it does shape the way they think about organizations they work for, and what role they play as well.
Yeah, really good point. Okay. So, and Meghan, what advice do you have for companies that are looking to expand and be highly attentive to reaching net zero? Give us the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step process.
So, there's some complexity in just the term net zero. And I would say one of the things, that I would advise organizations on is not necessarily just to say, we're going to hit net zero by 2050 without a plan, right? Or net zero even, or it doesn't have to be net zero. It could be any type of reduction target around greenhouse gas emissions, whether that's between now and 2030 or beyond. I would say to really look at it, with a measured approach. So making sure that you're not just setting a target without understanding necessarily the impact on your business, right? So whether that's understanding the capital that's going to need to be deployed, the pathway that you're going to need to take to reduce those emissions and what that's going to mean up and downstream of your organization, and really making sure that you're in a position, and this gets into the weeds a little bit, to quantify what your greenhouse gas emissions are, make sure you've got an accurate picture of that, and then really understanding the landscape of technology that's currently available, but likely will become available, between now and perhaps when you set your target for. And so understanding that landscape is really critical in setting a carbon reduction target, whether it's net zero or other.
So that's a good point. So how would companies go about measuring their current, carbon footprint? How would they say, okay, well, this is our carbon reduction strategy, and here's our tangible, measurable results in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? There's a lot of conversations out there about measuring, not actually being ethical. There's all kinds of issues about how people measure these things. There's lots of controversy about it, greenwashing and everything else. What's the way forward here? Because it's confusing.
It is confusing. So if we break it down into steps, Tina, I would say, the big thing, there are standards now in place for the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll try not to get too much in the weeds, but just to maybe bring it down to basics.
Mm-hmm.
Greenhouse gas emissions are categorized as Scope 1, which is your direct greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 2, which would be indirect emissions, which is essentially, if you're a business, indirect emissions would be associated, say, with your electricity usage.
Right.
Scope 3 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are essentially, an example would be emissions within your supply chain, right? And there's standards, and one example is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which essentially outlines, how to actually calculate those emissions, or the methodology to do that. And increasingly, with the regulatory landscape changing, there's a need to actually have an accurate picture of those emission scopes, before you start even reporting, or even, starting to actually set targets. So that's step 1.
Right.
Step 2 is then to say, okay, this is our greenhouse gas emissions footprint across our Scope 1, Scope 2, and perhaps Scope 3, although Scope 3 is harder to quantify. Mm-hmm. Now, what does it mean to actually set some sort of reduction target? If you're going to go and set a reduction target, though, you want to make sure that you're actually looking at that and comparing that to what your actual corporate, this is where I spend a lot of time with a lot of my colleagues, is looking at how do we actually look at our corporate strategy as an organization. And if we're going to go and set a carbon reduction, our greenhouse gas emissions target, what does that mean in light of our corporate strategy and our overall corporate objectives? And if we're going to go and say we're going to hit, a target by 2030 or beyond, how is that going to actually have an impact, or how is that going to drive our corporate strategy? And making sure that that thinking and that approach is part of that target setting. I've seen a lot of organizations not do that, and it has a serious knock-on effect on their business, right? Because they haven't necessarily considered the resources, the capital cost, the changing nature of the business environment, between when they set the time that they set the target and reaching the target. And so that's really critical. And then answering your second question around how you measure performance. One of the things that, I advise clients to do is really to think, if they're setting a target even out to 2050, that's a long time, right? Yeah. And you see a lot of targets out to that time frame. So it's important to measure progress and performance on a frequent basis, on an annual basis, frankly, to look at how you're actually progressing around that. Because in a business environment, the business will likely change a lot between now and, say, 2050. And so making sure you're putting measures in place to really assess performance and progress and impact to your business between, the time you set the target and when you hit the target is really, really critical.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And if you're a publicly traded company, is there a very a strong structure and protocol that you have to have we created a set of standards that are going to stick at this point?
That's a evolving space, Tina. So I would say yes, we are at a point where there's standardization of the measurement. the reporting landscape is changing, frankly, by the day. So there's a lot happening, and if we look at the Canadian, let's start with the Canadian landscape. We're starting to see some focus on regulating aspects of sustainability reporting, but it's starting primarily with climate change and climate risk, trying to drive towards some standardization. We saw, and it's still in litigation in the US, but the SEC came out with a rule around climate reporting on a global scale, though. There's a regulation called CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive out of Europe. And that's driving a lot of momentum on the sustainability standards space. So the short answer, Tina, is yes, we're starting to see, we're starting to see regulators really move the needle on requiring standardization and mandatory reporting on aspects of sustainability, because I made some opening remarks that these are non-financial issues. Increasingly, they are tied to financials, right? And our financial system is impacted by these issues. And so that's why you're starting to see the regulatory environment around reporting catch up.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. A really important piece of that puzzle.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting, and there's so many variables and so many moving parts and so many things impacting things. And like you said, looking out into the future, 2050 is a long, long way away. And so how do you position yourself and be in integrity with your goals and actually deal with the issues at hand? I mean, it's many, many conversations there. Okay. So is there anything, like any projects that you'd like to provide us with as powerful examples of where we're headed in terms of sustainable new energy space in Canada, and how we might be, I guess, position ourselves to be internationally attractive, to bring international investment to Canada in a way that has people feel secure investing here and trusting that our system is sustainably conscious?
I would say, there's so many different aspects of this, Tina. And, one example, which I would not necessarily equate it it is directly equated to energy, is carbon capture, utilization and storage. Even as recent as this week, a lot of discussion on, perhaps where some global investment is potentially, and I can't share all the details around that, but, looking at Canada as a space to invest. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion around EVs, right? So the policy, the federal policy around electric vehicles and what that's going to actually mean in terms of, our energy mix, as well as what, the knock-on effect of that policy. And so I think what we're going to start to see is a lot of, or at least I expect, a lot of attention on what it actually means for our energy ecosystem in Canada, and really unlocking different opportunities to attract global investment. And some of that's going to be driven by, to your point, the fact that we're really want to make sure that we have a policy landscape that is attractive to investors globally, but also to make sure that, we're adapting to innovation fast enough, right? Because to me, from what I understand, that's an attractive investment opportunity, right, for global investors, as well as for investors within the Canadian landscape, looking at, what role they play, to really support the energy transition in Canada. And I've seen that a lot working with clients on the financial side.
Yeah. And so when it comes to environmental, I guess, considerations, like investing in Canada and the regulatory process, a big part of that is being committed to the environment, but also making sure that those regulatory processes aren't lagging and full of make work policy, I guess. Make work project policy that's keeping us. It's a fine balance, isn't it? It's like walking the line, because you want to be very conscious of the environment, but at the same time, you don't want regulatory processes going on for years on end.
Absolutely. And that's one of the tensions, I would say, Tina, within the Canadian landscape. I won't profess to be a policy expert, but I would say that there's a lot of tension in the system in terms of, the development and launching of new innovation, right? And making sure that, the policy and regulatory hurdles don't slow us down, right?
Yeah.
Because that does have an impact on productivity. It has an impact on, getting these new, whether it's technologies to market, and
Yeah.
really making sure that we're looking at, the opportunity on a whole. And I would say, depending on what side of the country you're on, the policy landscape can be very, very challenging as it relates to just, and I'll say the energy transition, but that's, whether you're developing renewables or other, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really important, that we look at that policy landscape carefully so that it actually doesn't slow us down, frankly, in Canada.
Yeah. Such an interesting conversation, Meghan. So many great points. Before we finish up here, I know our time to talking together just flies by like this, but these have mostly been my questions. What do you feel are the important messages to get out there to the business community across Canada in your role, sort of, and also, I guess the second piece of that is looking out into the future. What do you think are going to be the really emerging trends that we should be paying attention to?
I would say the one thing, and again, I said this in some of my earlier remarks, it's really to look at the opportunity, because a lot of times we profess to say that sustainability is a cost, or we're doing it just out of the goodness of our own hearts. And we all, have, some level of drive to do that. But if you actually just bring it back to the basics, it's really to look at what is the business opportunity around sustainability or ESG for your business. If you're just getting started, that applies. But if you're also, more of a company that's been at this for a long time, it's really to peel back the layers and really understand how this gets to the heart of your strategy, and then recognize, the one thing that I was with a client earlier this week, and one of the things that I, speaking to the CEO, and I said, what's really, really critical, just given the poly-crisis environment that we're operating in globally, is to really be able to recognize the signposts of what's happening, whether it's geopolitical, some of the impacts of climate change, and I won't get into all of them. But increasingly, those issues, as I said earlier, are sort of underpinned in elements of sustainability. And so recognizing that environment around you as an organization is going to continue to swirl. And I would say the pace of that, it's almost speeding up like a tornado. And it's being able to actually recognize the signals of what's going on so that you don't have tunnel vision on your business, and you're able to actually future-proof, frankly, given the environment that you're operating in. And I know that sounds easy, me saying that, but it's going to become increasingly critical, just given what we're seeing. And, some of that's driven by disruption, whether you would categorize AI as disruptive or helpful, depending on where you sit, it could be both. And so just being able to actually poke your head up and really recognize what's going on around you, run scenarios, recognize the signposts, and then prepare. I would say we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years significant change in business models and operating environments, and really recognizing the role that technology is going to play in your business across the value chain. We're going to see a lot of transformation, and that's across all aspects of business, not just sustainability, but also looking at where technology can actually enable what you're doing, right, is really critical, and making sure that you're actually thinking about how that then ties to your investment and your capital planning, right? Because increasingly that's going to become important. And that's the reason why my opening remarks around integration of sustainability corporate strategy, really understanding the impact that that's going to have on the capital side of your business, is really, really critical.
Yeah, such important parts for sure. And I love that phrase that you use, future-proof your business, because I think when I look into the future, I think how to future-proof my business is simply to be used to all the change that's going to happen, like be a change agent, and just kind of go with all the change instead of trying to control it and hold on to the way things are supposed to be. It's more of a mindset of there's all these different things happening now. And I kind of look at the problems are the opportunity, and
Absolutely.
hopefully technology is going to be the savior of that. So if I'm having an issue with sales, it's like, okay, well, my old model of sales is no longer going to work. How is AI and automation going to solve that in the future?
Exactly.
Okay, I want to get into new markets. How is the new global conversation shifting and networking going to change that entirely? How,
Absolutely.
how is the technology solution? And the technology is out there. You think of the problem and then you go looking for the solution, and it's there.
Mhm.
That's the kind of time we're in. So it's like any sort of mindset that I have, like it's got to go a certain way. Every time I go to that place, I get stuck in my business, and I think that's the case for a lot of entrepreneurs.
It
And
is.
and it's like, I guess the message of the day is go with the flow.
It's go with the flow with an element of vision, right? Or at
Yeah,
least be able to watch out for the signals,
yeah,
so that you can get ahead. And that's sort of part of the future proofing
yeah,
comes.
for sure. It's like have a vision, and then you may not take the exact destination, but you're going that way, and utilize all of these new resources
Yeah,
around you. Yeah. And
absolutely.
ESG, to me, it used to be like the last thing you think of, and now it's the first thing you think of.
Yeah, and I would say, it's important to really, and we didn't get into this in detail, but understand what aspects of ESG matter to your business, right?
Mhm.
Because not every single issue under the E, the S, and the G necessarily is what I would say material, and I'll use that in quotations, to your business, right?
Yeah,
So really understanding that is critical to the development of a strategic plan.
yeah, precisely. Well, your wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much, Megan. Is there
Thank you
anything
for
else
having
you'd
me.
like to say before we finish up today?
No, I just appreciate the conversation. It was great to chat with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, Megan, for joining us today, sharing your valuable insights into the world of ESG strategy and advisory with PwC. To our listeners as well, thank you for tuning in to the OGM Livestream Energy Series. We're here. We do these every week, expanding and facilitating the process of energy development in our world. So stay tuned for more engaging discussions on the future of energy. Until next time, take care, stay energized. I'm Tina Olivero, your publisher of the OGM. Over and out.